The Inner Power Unveiled. Introduction. Let us begin with a truth that does not shout, yet cannot be ignored. Your mind is already creating your life, whether you command it or not. This is not a comforting metaphor. It is the mechanical law by which the subconscious operates. Most people live as if their thoughts were harmless, as if mental activity were something private, ephemeral, inconsequential. It is not. Your inner conversation is the blueprint from which your experiences unfold with quiet precision. I want you to consider something with absolute seriousness. Nothing in your external life has appeared without your internal participation. Even the conditions you call accidental have roots in patterns you've entertained repeatedly, patterns of expectation, self-concept, fear, or conviction. Joseph Murphy understood this not as wishful thinking, but as psychological causality. Your subconscious accepts what you feel to be true, not what you announce publicly, not what you say once to calm your anxiety. It accepts what you settle into, the atmosphere you return to when your guard is down, the conviction that sits beneath your explanations. So before you attempt to change anything outside, you must confront this simple, unavoidable fact. Your subconscious is listening to you every moment, and it takes you at your word. Not the word you speak, but the word you believe. If there is something in your life that feels immovable, it is not because the situation is strong. It is because the belief sustaining it has not been replaced. Change the belief, and the situation loses its foundation. This is not optimism, it is architecture. In these minutes we share together, you will not be asked to think positive or to repeat phrases you do not believe. That is superstition, not science. You will learn something far more powerful, how to install new patterns in the subconscious through understanding, repetition of feeling, and alignment with a self-concept capable of receiving what you desire. This is the work Murphy devoted his life to, changing the inner premise so the outer conclusion must follow. When you grasp this with clarity, you no longer chase results. You create causes. You adjust the internal mechanism, and reality rearranges itself accordingly. This is the level from which we will speak, not from enthusiasm, from principle, from precision, from the quiet authority of a law that never contradicts itself. Chapter 1. The Law Beneath Your Life. There comes a moment, quiet, unmistakable, when a person realizes that their explanations no longer hold. You look at your life with a certain honesty, without the usual excuses, without the protective stories, without the comfortable distortions, and something becomes clear. Your outer life has been moving in circles because your inner life has been repeating the same premise. This observation may arrive slowly or all at once. It may appear after a disappointment, after a success that still feels empty, or after seeing the same pattern re-emerge in a different form. But the realization itself is always the same. The effort has not been enough. Not because effort is useless, but because effort is not the source. Beneath everything you do, everything you struggle for, everything you attempt to fix, there is a deeper mechanism silently shaping the outcome. That mechanism is your subconscious mind. This is not an abstract poetic idea, it is the psychological law behind your experiences, a law as consistent as gravity and just as indifferent to your opinions about it. The subconscious does not adapt to your goals, it adapts to your beliefs. It does not respond to your hopes, it responds to your convictions. It does not obey your momentary enthusiasm, it obeys the emotional conclusions you return to repeatedly. This is why so many people feel trapped in their own lives, because they attempt to change the branches while the root remains untouched. They adjust behaviors, routines, schedules, opportunities. Yet the inner premise remains identical, so the outer results return to their original shape. This is not failure. This is the law functioning with absolute precision. You see, everything you have lived so far began as a premise in the mind. Not a passing thought, not an isolated emotion, but a pattern, absorbed, repeated, and eventually accepted as the way things are. Some of these patterns were chosen consciously. Most were not. They came from childhood impressions, cultural narratives, parental fears, personal interpretations, and unexamined conclusions formed long before you had the capacity to question them. Yet the subconscious adopted them all as instructions, not because you agreed with them, but because they were felt. What you feel repeatedly becomes what you believe, and what you believe repeatedly becomes what your subconscious expresses. It is important to understand the impartial nature of the subconscious. It does not judge your thoughts. It does not distinguish between desire and fear. It does not weigh intentions or morality. It does not filter ideas through logic. It accepts whatever is impressed upon it through feeling, and then reproduces it with unwavering fidelity. This explains why certain problems persist even when you actively fight against them. If the inner blueprint remains unchanged, the outer form cannot shift permanently. You might push against a circumstance temporarily, but once the effort fades, the old pattern reasserts itself, not because the pattern is strong, but because the belief beneath it has not been replaced. This is the point where Joseph Murphy's work becomes both liberating and confronting. It removes the illusion of luck, it removes the comfort of blame in circumstances, and it places the power and responsibility exactly where it has always been, within you. When you accept this, your life ceases to be a puzzle. You no longer wonder why certain things just happen. You no longer attribute your experiences to chance or fate. You recognize them as the visible expressions of an invisible premise, and this recognition marks the beginning of true change. From this point forward, your task is not to negotiate with circumstances, not to resist them, not to manipulate them, but to understand the premise producing them and to replace it with one that aligns with the life you actually desire. This is not positive thinking. This is not motivational rhetoric. This is the deliberate installation of new patterns into the subconscious mind. Patterns, not slogans. Convictions, not wishes. Emotional truths, not intellectual ideas. The subconscious responds to one thing, the belief you accept as real, and belief is not formed by the repetition of words, but by repetition of feeling. Your life begins to change when your emotional atmosphere changes, when your inner conclusion shifts from fear to possibility, from inadequacy to worthiness, from stagnation to ability. Understanding this, you stop trying to escape your life and begin to reconstruct it from within. Slowly, intentionally, with the same precision the subconscious uses to build your experience. This is the foundation. Everything that follows, imagination, emotion, faith, the I am, the process of release, will rest upon this single truth. Your subconscious does not express what you want. It expresses who you currently believe yourself to be. Change the belief, and the entire structure of your life must reorganize itself. This chapter is the doorway. You have stepped through it. Now we begin the real work. Chapter 2. The subconscious, the engine that never sleeps. Before you can transform the course of your life, you must understand the force that has been directing it quietly, consistently, and without your permission. Most people imagine that they live by conscious intention, by choice, by habit, or by desire. But the truth, simple and unavoidable, is that you are living from your subconscious compliance. The conscious mind discusses and debates. The subconscious mind accepts and executes. And whatever it accepts becomes the framework of your lived experience. Your subconscious is not theoretical. It is not symbolic or poetic. It is a psychological mechanism that influences every perception you have, every conclusion you draw, every emotional tendency you repeat, and every outcome that emerges in your life. You may not feel its movement, but you live inside its results every single day. It is the mind beneath your mind, the silent architect shaping the structure you call my life. This deeper mind does not rest. The conscious mind grows tired, scattered, anxious, and reactive. It becomes overwhelmed and seeks distraction. But beneath it, the subconscious continues its work without interruption. When you sleep, the conscious mind withdraws into silence, but the subconscious remains fully alert, fully receptive. It absorbs the emotional residue of your day, the beliefs you have rehearsed, the dominant conclusions you have entertained, and it begins organizing your reality around them. It never questions, never argues, and never suspends its function. It accepts, and once it accepts, it produces. People often imagine that saying something enough times will convince the subconscious. They assume that words alone carry the power to transform. But the subconscious does not respond to words. It responds to the feeling behind the words. It understands emotional truth, not verbal insistence. A statement you do not believe, no matter how frequently repeated, leaves no impression. A belief you accept emotionally, even once, alters the entire direction of your experience. The subconscious mind does not interpret language. It interprets the emotional atmosphere in which that language exists. If you tell yourself that you are confident while feeling profoundly unsure, the subconscious accepts the uncertainty, not the phrase. It cannot be deceived by language because it takes its orders from emotion. Every strong feeling is received as instruction. Fear is not recognized as something you wish to avoid. It is recognized as a certainty you are affirming. Guilt is not interpreted as regret. It is interpreted as punishment you believe you deserve. Unworthiness is not perceived as sadness. It is taken as identity. The subconscious is literal. Whatever emotional state you dwell in becomes the blueprint it tries to replicate. The more intensely you feel something, the more quickly it becomes creative material for your outer life. This is why change attempted through willpower alone fails. People try to force themselves into new behaviors while carrying old convictions. They attempt to discipline themselves into new habits while maintaining the identity that contradicts them. The conscious mind tries to drag the body into a new future, while the subconscious is quietly pulling it back into the familiar past. It is not that your willpower is weak. It is simply that willpower cannot override a subconscious premise. You cannot act consistently in a way that contradicts what you believe to be true about yourself. Real change begins the moment your inner conclusion shifts. When the subconscious accepts a new idea, behavior adjusts naturally. What once required discipline now unfolds without effort. What previously felt impossible becomes strangely easy. You stop wrestling with yourself because the conflict between the conscious and subconscious mind dissolves. You are no longer trying to act differently. You are becoming someone for whom different action is natural. It is important to understand that the subconscious is neither your enemy nor your rescuer. It operates without preference. It does not categorize your beliefs into helpful or harmful. It simply works to maintain consistency with whatever convictions you have accepted. If you have accepted lack, it reproduces lack. If you have accepted inadequacy, it shapes experiences that confirm inadequacy. If you have accepted the possibility, It organizes events that align with that possibility. It does not distinguish between imagination and memory. A vividly imagined fear is treated the same as a past trauma. A deeply felt desire is treated the same as an accomplished fact. The subconscious cares only about emotional authenticity. When you recognize this, you discover that your point of power has never been in the external world. It has always been in the internal premise that precedes it. Changing your life is not a matter of fighting circumstances or negotiating with conditions. It is a matter of replacing the belief that generates them. And once the subconscious accepts a new pattern, your life, with absolute reliability, begins to reorganize itself around that pattern. This chapter exists for one purpose: to reveal the engine beneath your experience so you can learn to direct it. Because once you understand how the subconscious functions, you no longer seek change outside yourself. You create it where it truly begins, within. Chapter 3. Emotion. The substance that shapes the invisible. If thought forms the outline of your inner world, then emotion provides the substance. The subconscious does not move because you think. It moves because you feel. This is the point where most people misunderstand their own creative power. They believe that ideas alone are transformative, that intellectual clarity equals inner change. But your life does not bend to your thoughts. It bends to the emotional weight those thoughts carry. Emotion is the language of the subconscious. It is the currency it trades in, the measure by which it determines what is real to you. You may declare that you are capable, worthy, abundant, or at peace. But if the emotional climate within you contradicts those statements, the subconscious ignores the words entirely. It takes instruction only from the feeling that dominates. A person who says, "I am safe," while living in anxiety, is instructing the subconscious through anxiety. A person who says, "I believe in myself," while feeling unimportant, is instructing the subconscious through unimportance. The subconscious accepts the emotional reality, not the verbal announcement. This is not cruelty. It is precision. Emotion reveals what you truly believe. Thought may deceive you. Intention may flatter you. But emotion exposes what you have accepted as true. And the subconscious, faithful to its nature, constructs your experience around that acceptance. To understand this is to understand why certain emotional states linger for years. People do not remain in fear because fear is powerful. They remain in fear because fear has become familiar, and familiarity is the most persuasive form of belief. The subconscious does not care whether a feeling is pleasant or painful. It cares whether the feeling is repeated. Repetition creates identity, and identity creates experience. If fear, guilt, or inadequacy have been rehearsed often enough, they become the emotional center from which the subconscious works. You may have noticed that some people organize their entire lives around emotions they cannot seem to escape. They have the same arguments, make the same choices, attract the same difficulties, because their emotional state has become a self-fulfilling prophecy. The subconscious is not trapping them. It is following its instructions with absolute loyalty. It is giving form to what they continue to feel. This is why change begins not with new information, but with new emotional impressions. You cannot think your way out of a feeling that has been practiced for years. You must replace the emotional foundation that sustains it. This is not a matter of suppression or denial. You cannot silence fear by pretending it is not there. You cannot erase guilt by ignoring it. The subconscious does not respond to avoidance. It responds to the emotional truth that lies beneath your attempts to avoid it. Transformation begins when you observe your emotions without collapsing into them, when you recognize that your feelings are not prophecies but interpretations. When you allow yourself to feel without granting the feeling the authority to define you. The moment you separate your identity from your emotional state, you create the possibility of change. You are no longer the fear, you are the one noticing fear. You are no longer the guilty, you are the one examining guilt. You are no longer the inadequacy, you are the one questioning why inadequacy was accepted in the first place. This distance is not detachment, it is mastery. It is the point at which the subconscious becomes accessible, because the subconscious cannot be influenced when you are lost inside your emotions. It can only be influenced when you are aware of them. Awareness weakens old emotional patterns. Awareness dissolves their authority. And into that space, a new emotional reality can be introduced, one that the subconscious will eventually adopt as its new instruction. There is a process to this, and it is simple, though not easy. You feel the emotion without fleeing it. You acknowledge its existence without endorsing its conclusion. You let it move through you without allowing it to install itself as identity. The subconscious begins to sense a shift. The old emotional state is no longer being accepted as command. The feeling no longer carries the same conviction. The blueprint begins to loosen. Then, and only then, can a new emotional state take its place. Not forced, not fabricated, not imposed by willpower, but gently introduced. You begin to cultivate feelings of assurance, possibility, calm, worthiness, not as desperate attempts to escape your old self, but as deliberate choices in the direction of your new one. You allow yourself to feel these emotions briefly, even if they seem unfamiliar. The subconscious records the impression, and with repetition, the unfamiliar becomes familiar. The unfamiliar becomes comfortable, the unfamiliar becomes true. Emotion is the substance the subconscious shapes into form. Change the emotional foundation, and the entire structure of your life reorganizes around it. This is not magic. It is law. You may resist this at first. You may find yourself returning to familiar internal images, not because they serve you, but because they are habitual. The mind gravitates toward what it knows. If you have spent years imagining disappointment, success will feel foreign. If you have spent years imagining conflict, harmony will feel unnatural. But unfamiliar does not mean impossible. It only means unpracticed. Imagination requires repetition. The subconscious accepts the images you return to consistently, not the ones you visit occasionally. You are not forcing a belief into place. You are introducing a new emotional pattern until it becomes the path of least resistance. And once it becomes that, the subconscious expresses it as lived reality. The outer world must eventually mirror the inner image with the same reliability that a reflection mirrors the object before it. There is a quiet dignity to this process. You are not begging for change. You are training the mind. You are not persuading the universe. You are instructing the subconscious. You are not hoping to become someone new. You are rehearsing the emotional truth of someone you have not yet allowed yourself to be. Imagination is not fantasy. It is a rehearsal. It is preparation. It is the mind's way of making the desired state emotionally real before it becomes externally visible. When imagination and emotion align, the subconscious receives a new directive. And once it receives that directive, your outer life must shift to accommodate it. In this way, imagination becomes the architect of experience. It is where your future begins long before it reaches your senses. It is where identity is shaped, where limits dissolve, where the blueprint is rewritten. You are not imagining escaping reality. You are imagining creating it. Chapter 5. The invisible dialogue that writes your life. There is a form of speech more powerful than anything you say aloud. It is the internal dialogue that runs beneath your awareness, the quiet stream of interpretation that never stops flowing. It comments on everything you encounter, everything you attempt, everything you fear, and everything you hope for. And while most people believe their life is shaped by external events, it is this silent dialogue that shapes those events by determining the meaning you assign to them. Your subconscious listens to this inner speech with more attention than it gives to anything else. External words may impress it momentarily, but your internal words train it continuously. What you repeatedly say to yourself becomes the emotional atmosphere the subconscious adopts as truth. And once it adopts that truth, it constructs your outer experience around it with absolute precision. This is where many people misunderstand their own suffering. They are not simply reacting to life, they are reacting to the interpretation they have placed upon life. Two people can experience the same event and walk away with entirely different emotional conclusions because their inner dialogue narrates the event differently. One person may say internally, "This confirms that I can't succeed," while another says, "This was a temporary obstacle." The external event is identical, the internal meaning is not, and it is the meaning, not the event, that becomes the subconscious instruction. If you observe your internal dialogue honestly, you will discover that it has been repeating the same themes for years. Themes of doubt, guilt, resentment, inadequacy, fear, or hesitation may have become the default responses to any stimulus. These responses feel automatic because they have been rehearsed. But rehearsal does not make them true, it makes them familiar. And the subconscious accepts the familiar with little resistance. Most people attempt to improve their circumstances without addressing this inner monologue. They set goals, change routines, modify behaviors, and restructure their lives, yet the internal narrative remains untouched. And if the narrative remains untouched, the identity remains untouched. And if the identity remains untouched, the subconscious continues to reproduce the same reality, no matter how diligently the conscious mind tries to escape it. You may not realize how frequently your internal dialogue contradicts your desires. When you aspire to something greater, a quiet voice may respond, "Be realistic." When you attempt something new, another voice may whisper, "You won't succeed." When you imagine a better life, a familiar sentence might return, "That isn't for people like you." These statements are rarely loud. They are subtle, woven into your thought process so seamlessly that you mistake them for logic, when in truth they are conditioning. This dialogue is not an enemy. It is simply the residue of earlier conclusions you accepted without question. Every time you felt inadequate, every time you fearfully anticipated failure, every time someone spoke to you from their own limitations, these impressions formed a script. The subconscious recorded that script, and unless replaced, it continues to repeat it. To change your subconscious pattern, you must change the dialogue that feeds it. This does not mean arguing with yourself or forcing aggressive affirmations. It means becoming aware of the internal sentences that shape your emotional climate. Awareness breaks the automatic nature of these thoughts. Once you hear them clearly, you are no longer compelled to believe them. You begin to see that they are not absolute truths, but conditioned responses. There is a pivotal moment in this work when you hear yourself think something you have thought 1,000 times before, and for the first time you recognize that it is not a fact. It is a habit. That moment weakens its authority. It creates the space needed for a new internal narrative to emerge. When you introduce new thoughts, they must carry emotional sincerity. Hollow words do not impress the subconscious, but quiet, steady statements that align with your emerging self-concept do. You are not trying to drown out the old dialogue, you are replacing it with one that reflects the life you intend to live. This process is not dramatic. It is subtle. You begin to respond to yourself differently. You question the old narratives. You decline to accept their conclusions. You create new interpretations that affirm possibility rather than limitation. Over time, the subconscious begins to adopt the new script. The old sentences lose their emotional charge. The new ones gain authority. And because the subconscious expresses whatever script it holds, your outer life begins to reflect the shift. Internal dialogue is the most powerful tool you possess because it is ongoing. It is the conversation you never leave. It is the commentary that shapes your self-concept, and your self-concept shapes everything else. When you understand this, you stop trying to manipulate circumstances and instead focus on the dialogue that predetermines them. The world you see is built from the words you repeat within yourself. Change those words, and the structure of your life must eventually follow. Chapter 6. Identity. The silent limit behind every desire. Every desire you hold, every goal you imagine, and every possibility you hope for is filtered through a single decisive structure, your self-concept. Before any dream can take form in your life, it must pass through the identity you have accepted as me. If the desire contradicts the identity prevails. The subconscious does not allow you to outrun your sense of self. It compels your circumstances to remain consistent with it. This principle is difficult for many to accept because it exposes the true cause of most disappointments. People believe they fail because conditions were unfavorable, resources were limited, timing was poor, or other people blocked their progress. But beneath every external reason lies one internal cause. The subconscious will not sustain what the self-concept rejects. You may achieve something temporarily. You may reach for something briefly. You may force progress through willpower, but if the identity does not match the outcome dissolves. Your self-concept is not the personality you show the world, nor the traits you casually list when someone asks about you. It is the quiet conclusion you hold about yourself, the unspoken, unquestioned belief about what you can receive, what you can endure, what you can accomplish, and what you deserve. This conclusion, formed over years of emotional experiences, quietly determines the limits of your life. You cannot outperform it. You cannot escape it. You can only change it. Most self-concepts are formed accidentally. They grow out of childhood interpretations, the reflected opinions of others, repeated emotional reactions, and the meaning you assigned to earlier experiences. You may not remember when you first decided you were unworthy, incapable, invisible, or destined for struggle, but the subconscious remembers, and it has been faithfully expressing that conclusion ever since. It is not doing so maliciously. It is doing so because identity is the foundation of all expression. The subconscious creates conditions that align with your self-concept, not because it wants to restrict you, but because it has been instructed to maintain internal consistency. This is why you may find yourself returning to familiar kinds of relationships, familiar forms of work, familiar emotional states, and familiar outcomes, even when you consciously desire something different. The familiar identity directs your attention, shapes your expectations, influences your decisions, and filters your interpretation of events. It selects the opportunities you notice and overlooks the ones that contradict its premise. Your life does not reflect your desires. It reflects the identity from which your desires arise. If you want a new life, you must construct a new identity, one that matches the person who naturally receives what you seek. This construction is not a matter of pretending or forcing a new image onto the mind. It is a matter of examining the emotional conclusions you have been carrying and recognizing them for what they are, outdated interpretations that have been allowed to control you long after their context expired. When you recognize that a self-limiting belief is not an inherent truth but a conditioned idea, it begins to lose its authority. Identity loosens. The shift in self-concept begins quietly. You stop accepting the automatic interpretations you once believed. You no longer collapse into old labels. You no longer speak to yourself from the viewpoint of inadequacy. You create distance between you and the identity that has been governing your life. This distance is not denial. It is clarity. It is the recognition that you are not bound by earlier assumptions. As this clarity deepens, you begin to introduce subtle but powerful internal adjustments. You speak to yourself from a different premise. You allow yourself to imagine being someone you have not yet been. You rehearse emotional states that contradict your old identity. You entertain the possibility that you are capable of receiving more than you previously assumed. And the subconscious, sensitive to emotional truth, begins to adopt these new impressions. Identity does not change through ambition. It changes through familiarity. The more familiar you become with the feeling of capability, worthiness, competence, and possibility, the more natural those states become. Eventually, the subconscious accepts them as the new blueprint. And once the blueprint changes, your life must follow. You begin to attract experiences that match the revised self-concept. You notice opportunities that once went unseen. You tolerate conditions that reflect your values and reject those that contradict it. Decisions that were once unthinkable become effortless. Patterns that once felt inevitable dissolve. Your self-concept is the gatekeeper of your destiny. It determines what you allow into your life and what you push away without realizing it. When you change this inner structure, you do not merely achieve different results. You become a different person, one whose outer world can finally reflect the potential that was always present within you. The transformation begins not with effort, but with identity. And once identity changes, everything else aligns. Chapter 7. Faith. The quiet certainty that rewrites reality. Faith is a word people use casually, almost carelessly, but few understand its true role in the mechanics of the mind. In the context of the subconscious, faith is not religious sentiment, blind optimism, or wishful thinking. It is not the hope that something might happen. Faith, as Joseph Murphy understood it, is psychological certainty, an inner acceptance so complete that the subconscious treats it as fact. And whatever the subconscious treats as fact, it expresses. Every person lives by faith, whether they realize it or not. The anxious person has faith in misfortune. The insecure person has faith in inadequacy. The pessimist has faith in unfavorable outcomes. Their faith is not uplifting, but it is faith nonetheless, an unquestioned acceptance of a particular conclusion. And the subconscious, unbothered by the content of that conclusion, obediently reshapes life around it. This is the first unsettling truth. You already possess deep faith, but it may be directed toward the wrong outcomes. Faith governs your reality because it determines your emotional expectations. It is not what you hope for, but what you know internally, even when you cannot justify it. You may want success, but if you expect disappointment, disappointment will come. You may want affection, but if you expect rejection, rejection will appear. The expectation precedes the experience, and the subconscious ensures the two match. This is not a mystical force. It is psychological alignment. You behave in ways that confirm your expectations. You make choices that reflect your internal assumptions. You see possibilities that align with your faith and ignore those that contradict it. You interpret ambiguous events according to your underlying conviction. And the world responds to your behavior, your choices, your interpretation, eventually forming a reality that matches the belief beneath it. When Murphy spoke of faith, he was pointing to this internal certainty. Faith is the moment the subconscious accepts a new premise. It is the moment you stop rehearsing the past and begin rehearsing a future that feels emotionally authentic. It is the moment you stop negotiating with doubt and begin living from an inner conclusion that requires no external evidence to sustain it. People confuse faith with intensity. They think that strong emotional effort produces results. But faith is not intensity. It is the absence of resistance. It is the quiet conviction that requires no rehearsal because it feels natural. When you have faith in your limitations, you do not need to repeat them. They operate silently in the background. The same must become true of your desired identity. It must feel quiet, stable, and obvious. That is faith. You may wonder how such certainty can be formed when your current life contradicts it. The answer is simple, though not easy. The subconscious does not need external proof. It needs internal acceptance. You do not develop faith by convincing yourself with arguments. You develop faith by repeatedly entering the emotional state that matches the belief you wish to adopt. Over time, that state becomes familiar. Familiarity becomes comfort. Comfort becomes acceptance, and acceptance becomes faith. This process often begins in subtle ways. You imagine a different version of yourself, not dramatically, not desperately, but calmly. You sit with the feeling of capability, worthiness, freedom, or stability, even if only for a moment. You allow yourself to experience the emotional tone of the life you desire before it exists. You do this not to escape your current reality, but to signal to the subconscious that this feeling is allowed, that this identity is possible, that this version of you has a place within your inner world. The subconscious responds to this repetition. It does not change overnight, but it does change. The old emotional patterns lose intensity and the new ones gain presence. Eventually, a shift occurs. The desired feeling no longer feels foreign. It begins to feel natural. When this happens, the subconscious adopts it as truth. That adoption is faith. Once faith is established, you no longer strain to maintain the belief. You no longer argue with yourself or look for external validation. You no longer rehearse the old identity. You act from a new internal premise without effort. And because your subconscious now sees this premise as reality, your outer world gradually aligns with it. Faith is not a dramatic surge of inspiration. It is the quiet certainty that emerges when your inner world has accepted a new truth. And once that truth is accepted, transformation becomes inevitable. The subconscious has received its new instruction, and your reality must reorganize itself accordingly. Faith is not the reward of change. Faith is the cause of it. Chapter 8. Detachment. Releasing the mind that tries to force outcomes. Detachment is one of the least understood aspects of inner transformation. People often mistake it for indifference, resignation, or emotional withdrawal, imagining that it requires them to stop caring about their desires. But detachment, in the context of the subconscious, is none of these things. It is not the abandonment of desire. It is the removal of internal friction. It is the quiet release of the mental interference that prevents the subconscious from doing its work. You interfere when you try to control outcomes through anxiety. You interfere when you question the process at every step. You interfere when you demand constant reassurance from the external world. These tendencies are common, but they are not harmless. Every attempt to force the future into submission communicates one message to the subconscious: I do not believe this is possible. And the subconscious, always obedient, always literal, follows that message rather than the words you speak on top of it. This is why Murphy emphasized detachment with such clarity. The subconscious needs a clear instruction, not a desperate one. It responds to inner certainty, not emotional struggle. When you cling to a desire with tension, fear, or impatience, you create emotional evidence that the desired outcome is not yet yours. The subconscious reacts to that evidence and begins to express a reality that matches your doubt rather than your intention. Detachment, therefore, is the state in which you no longer contradict your desire with fear. It is not the removal of intention, it is the removal of resistance. It is the shift from "I must have this" to "I am prepared for this." The former is rooted in fear of its absence. The latter is rooted in acceptance of its eventual fulfillment. One constricts, the other allows. To understand detachment, consider how naturally you expect familiar outcomes. If you believe something always goes wrong, you feel no need to monitor the process. You assume the disappointment is inevitable. That assumption, negative as it may be, is a form of detachment, because it is an expectation without resistance. It is a conclusion you have accepted so deeply that you no longer question it. Detachment in transformation functions the same way, but is directed toward your desired outcome instead of your fears. When you have accepted a new premise internally, you stop negotiating with it. You no longer check whether it is working. You no longer seek signs. You no longer reinterpret every minor event as a message from the universe. You simply proceed as someone who knows the result is unfolding, whether or not the outer world has caught up. That is detachment, the cessation of inner contradiction. People fear detachment because they believe that worry proves commitment. They believe that monitoring the process increases control. They believe that emotional tension demonstrates importance. But worry does not accelerate manifestation, it slows it. Monitoring does not clarify, it distorts. Tension does not prove desire, it reveals disbelief. Detachment frees the subconscious to operate without interference. It is the moment you stop pulling up the seed to check whether it is growing. It is the moment you stop insisting that the outer world provide immediate validation. It is the moment you stop forcing an outcome that can only be produced from within. This release does not make you passive. It makes you coherent. You act from the identity that corresponds to your desire rather than from the insecurity that contradicts it. You move with clarity instead of urgency. You respond to life with stability instead of agitation. Your behavior becomes aligned, not frantic. Detachment also restores emotional balance. When you no longer pressure life to prove itself to you, your nervous system relaxes. Your mind becomes clearer. You regain access to intuition, creativity, and decision-making, capacities that are blocked when you are consumed by attachment. Your world becomes larger, not smaller, because your awareness is no longer confined to your fear. Over time, detachment becomes a quiet confidence. You begin to trust the process not because of evidence, but because your internal state no longer contradicts your intention. You feel the difference between wanting from desperation and wanting from certainty. You notice that when you stop forcing outcomes, opportunities arise more naturally. You recognize that the subconscious was never the obstacle. The interference was. Detachment is the moment the inner conclusion becomes stronger than external circumstance. It is the recognition that the subconscious does not need your supervision. It needs your clarity. Once that clarity is established, your only task is to live from the identity that aligns with your desire, while allowing the mechanics of the subconscious to perform the invisible work. Detachment does not weaken desire. It strengthens belief. And belief, once stable, allows reality to reorganize itself without your constant interference. By Chapter 9. I am, the mind's most definitive command. Every word you speak to yourself carries influence, but the words that follow I am carry authority. They are not descriptions. They are commands. They are the instructions by which the subconscious organizes identity, and identity determines the boundaries of your experience. People often use these words carelessly, unaware that each statement becomes a psychological directive shaping their future circumstances. I am tired. I am unlucky. I am always anxious. I am not the type of person who succeeds. These phrases may feel like innocent observations, but to the subconscious, they are not reflections. They are definitions. And once a definition is accepted, the subconscious begins to enforce it. It adjusts your emotional patterns, your decisions, your attention, and your interpretation of life so that your outer world remains consistent with your inner declaration. This is why Joseph Murphy emphasized the I am principle with such precision. He understood that the subconscious does not merely respond to what you feel, it responds to who you claim to be. Identity supersedes desire. You cannot receive what contradicts your I am, no matter how passionately you wish for it. If you say, I want success, while believing I am inadequate, the inadequacy prevails. If you say, I want peace, while believing I am unstable, instability dominates. The subconscious does not grant exceptions. It expresses the identity it has been instructed to maintain. Many people attempt to improve their lives through surface-level affirmations, repeating positive phrases with hope but without conviction. The subconscious does not respond to empty repetition. It responds to the emotional truth behind the words. When I am is spoken without alignment, the statement is rejected. It is treated as noise, not instruction. This leads people to believe that change is impossible. In reality, their statements lack the emotional authenticity required to influence the subconscious. To use I am effectively, you must approach it with precision. You are not inventing qualities, you are selecting them. You are choosing the identity that corresponds to the life you intend to live. You do not need to leap from one extreme to another. You begin with what feels incrementally truer than the current identity. If I am confident feels hollow, you might begin with I am becoming more stable in myself. If I am successful feels distant, you might adopt I am capable of more than I previously assumed. These statements create emotional openings. They begin to shift the internal narrative without triggering the subconscious rejection that arises when a statement contradicts your entire emotional history. Over time, these incremental identities accumulate. They reshape the internal blueprint and loosen the grip of old definitions. The subconscious begins to release outdated instructions and adopt new ones. The emotional responses associated with the old identity lose their strength. The behavior that once felt automatic begins to change. You start to move in alignment with the identity you are rehearsing rather than the one you inherited. The transformation that arises from I am is not forced. It is absorbed. It occurs quietly, gradually, as the subconscious internalizes the new directive. Eventually, the identity you once rehearsed becomes natural. You no longer need to repeat it consciously because it has become the default operating principle of your mind. And your life shifts accordingly, not through effort, but through alignment. This is why identity appears to change suddenly, even though the process has been unfolding internally for some time. There comes a moment when the subconscious no longer sees the new identity as unfamiliar. It accepts it, and once accepted, it expresses it. You begin to behave, respond, and choose from a place that matches your revised sense of self. Opportunities that previously felt unreachable become accessible. Situations that once intimidated you lose their power. Patterns that once defined you dissolve. The words I am are the gateway into this process. They are the means by which you instruct the subconscious to redefine the limits of your life. Used unconsciously, they reinforce limitation. Used consciously, they dismantle it. They are the most direct form of communication between your intention and your deeper mind. When you understand this, you stop using I am to describe your current state and begin using it to shape your future state. You recognize that identity is not a reflection of life. Life is a reflection of identity. And the identity you claim, calmly, sincerely, consistently, becomes the blueprint from which the subconscious constructs your experience. I am is not a phrase, it is the law by which you become. Chapter 10. Allowing. The point where inner reality begins to materialize. There comes a stage in the creative process where your inner work must be left to operate without your constant supervision. This stage is allowing, an internal posture in which the mind ceases to interfere and permits the subconscious to externalize what has been impressed upon it. Allowing is not passive. It is not indifference, nor is it the absence of desire. It is the quiet recognition that once an instruction has been accepted within, the outer expression is inevitable. People often misunderstand this stage because they imagine that constant mental effort accelerates results. They think that holding the desire tightly, thinking about it constantly, monitoring its progress and demanding immediate evidence proves their commitment. But such behavior does not reflect commitment, it reflects doubt. When you trust a process, you do not watch it anxiously. When you believe an outcome is unfolding, you do not interrogate the timing. When your subconscious has accepted a new identity, you do not need to check whether it is working. You live from it. Allowing is the absence of contradiction. It is the removal of the mental tension that arises when you simultaneously claim a desire and fear its absence. This contradiction is the greatest obstacle to manifestation because the subconscious does not respond to the desire, it responds to the emotional climate surrounding the desire. When you want something with desperation, the emotional tone is not abundance but scarcity. The subconscious expresses the tone, not the wish. Allowing dissolves this contradiction. It places you in a state where your desire no longer threatens your sense of security. You cease to fear its delay because you no longer question its inevitability. You know that the outer world is simply the final step of a process that has already begun internally. To reach this state, you must understand the relationship between your inner identity and your external experience. When you have adopted a new identity, you no longer relate to your desire as something distant. You relate to it as something congruent with who you already are. There is no strain in wanting what aligns with your self-concept. You do not long for it, plead for it, or chase it. You recognize it as natural. You allow it to unfold because you no longer feel separate from it. Allowing becomes possible when the identity shift is real. Before that shift occurs, allowing is difficult because the old self-concept feels threatened by the new intention. You will experience impatience, anxiety, and doubt because your current identity cannot support the desired outcome. Once the identity has changed, allowing becomes the most natural thing in the world. You do not need to force it. You simply stop interfering. This is why the outer world often changes after a period of apparent inactivity within you. There is a moment when the subconscious quietly adopts the new blueprint, and from that moment forward, the outer world begins to reorganize without your conscious involvement. You may notice subtle changes at first, a different tone in your interactions, a new idea arising spontaneously, a shift in your choices, a new openness in your perception. These are not coincidences. They are indicators that the subconscious has begun restructuring your life around its new premise. When allowing becomes your natural state, you no longer assign urgency to what you desire. Urgency is a symptom of disbelief. You recognize that time is merely the outer sequence of the inner acceptance. The process is already in motion, and the timing is shaped by the reorganization of both your mind and your circumstances. You stop trying to manipulate the sequence. You stop attempting to accelerate events. You allow the subconscious to operate with the intelligence it always had. Allowing also opens the mind to intuitive guidance. When you are no longer tense, anxious, or forcing outcomes, you create space for insight. Ideas appear with clarity. You recognize opportunities you previously ignored. You act from a place of internal coherence rather than emotional desperation. The actions that arise from this state feel effortless, not because they require no energy, but because they no longer carry the weight of fear. At its core, allowing is the recognition that you have done your part. You have formed the desire, you have impressed it upon the subconscious, you have adopted the identity that aligns with it. Now, the subconscious must do its work, and it will, provided you do not interrupt the process with doubt, fear, or compulsive control. Allowing is the final cooperation with the law. It is the moment you acknowledge that inner reality precedes outer manifestation. And once that acknowledgement becomes stable, the external world must eventually reflect the instruction contained within the subconscious. Allowing is not waiting. It is trusting, and trust is the bridge through which the invisible becomes visible.